Trust is fragile. The moment it's broken, it cuts deeper than any blade, and the scar never fades. I used to think that betrayal was something that happened to other people, not me. My life was simple, predictable, and wrapped in the illusion of stability. I had a husband who seemed devoted, and a best friend who was like a sister to me. But life has a cruel sense of humor, and I learned the hard way that the people closest to you are the ones who can destroy you the most. It started with small things I brushed off at first. My best friend, Emily, had always been close to my husband, Daniel. They joked around, exchanged glances, and shared inside jokes that I wasn't always part of. I told myself it was nothing. After all, Emily was practically family. She had been there through everything. My wedding, the tough times, the quiet victories. I thought I knew her heart. One evening, Emily called me in tears. Her voice was trembling, broken. "I need you," she whispered. "Please, you're the only one who can help me." Without hesitation, I rushed to her apartment. My heart raced as I knocked on her door. When it swung open, I found her sitting on the floor, clutching her wrist. Blood trickled down her arm. "Emily!" I dropped to my knees, grabbing a towel from the table and wrapping it around her wrist. "What happened?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. I didn't know what else to do. I calmed her down, called for help, and stayed with her the entire night at the hospital. When Daniel arrived, he wrapped his arms around me, his face full of concern. But there was something in his eyes when he looked at Emily, something that made my stomach tighten. I convinced myself I was imagining it. Emily recovered quickly, but things started to shift. Daniel began to spend more time with her. At first, it was under the excuse of checking on her. Then it became casual lunches. I told myself I was overthinking. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, Daniel came home late. His shirt was wrinkled, and his tie was undone. "Where were you?" I asked. He hesitated for a moment. "I was with Emily. She needed someone to talk to." My chest tightened. "It's becoming a habit. She's going through a tough time," he said, brushing past me. "You wouldn't understand." That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed every interaction, every stolen glance. I hated the feeling creeping up my spine, the feeling that I was losing control. Then it happened. I came home early one afternoon. The house was quiet except for muffled voices coming from the bedroom. My heart raced. I stepped toward the door, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. Emily, Daniel, together. My breath hitched. Daniel froze, his face turning pale. Emily's lips curled into a smile, not of embarrassment but of triumph. "You!" My voice cracked. "How could you?" Daniel scrambled to his feet. "It's not what it looks like." Emily stood, adjusting her dress casually. "Actually, it's exactly what it looks like." My vision blurred with tears. "You were my best friend." Emily's smile sharpened. "And that's why you never saw it coming." I stumbled backward, my whole world crumbling. Daniel reached for me, but I pulled away. "Don't touch me." Emily tilted her head. "You know, it's funny. You saved me that night. You put your life on hold for me. But you were so naive." I felt like the floor beneath me was collapsing. My chest burned with betrayal, rage, and heartbreak. I ran from the room, tears streaming down my face. That night, I sat alone, gripping my wedding ring in my palm. My heart felt like it had been ripped from my chest. The person I trusted most had orchestrated my downfall, and Daniel had willingly played his part. Emily had been planning this from the beginning. That night when she called me, bleeding and broken, it was a setup, a trap. She knew I would rush to her side, leaving my marriage vulnerable. She had counted on my loyalty and used it to take everything I had. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My chest was hollow. My mind raced. How could I have been so blind? How could I have trusted them both so completely? The next day, Daniel tried to apologize. He sat across from me, his face pale, his eyes red-rimmed. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. I stared at him, cold and empty. "But you did. It just happened." "No," I said, my voice sharpening. "It didn't just happen. You let it happen. You chose her." He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "I love you," he whispered. I stood. My hands trembled, but my voice was steady. If you loved me, you wouldn't have betrayed me. Emily showed up at my house the next day, pretending to be concerned. I'm sorry you had to find out like that, she said, not even bothering to hide the smugness in her tone. You're not sorry, I said. She smiled faintly. You'll get over it. I stared at her, really stared at her. I had spent years thinking Emily was my friend, my sister. But the person standing in front of me was a stranger. A manipulator. A thief. I won't forgive you, I said quietly. And you'll regret underestimating me. Emily's smile faltered. We'll see. As she walked away, I felt something shift inside me, a spark of resolve. The pain was still there, raw and deep, but beneath it was something else. Fire. They had taken everything from me. But I wasn't broken. Not yet. And this time, I wouldn't be the one left bleeding. The days after the betrayal felt like a blur, a slow, aching fog that wrapped around my chest and refused to let go. Every corner of the house felt haunted by memories of Daniel and Emily, his laughter in the kitchen, her voice echoing through the hallway. My heart tightened each time I remembered how blind I had been. I stopped answering Daniel's calls. The sound of his name on my phone screen made my stomach turn. Emily didn't even bother pretending to feel guilty. Her silence was louder than any apology she could have offered. One afternoon, I stood by the window, watching the rain hit the glass in soft, steady drops. My reflection stared back at me, pale, hollow-eyed, a stranger. The woman I had become was not the woman I used to be. The betrayal had carved into me, leaving deep scars beneath the surface. My phone buzzed on the table. It was Daniel. I ignored it. A minute later, a text followed. We need to talk. I scoffed, my fingers tightening around the phone. We had nothing to talk about. But another text followed. Please. It's important. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe I needed to hear him admit what I already knew, that I had been nothing more than a pawn in their twisted game. We met at a quiet cafe. Daniel was already seated when I arrived, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup. His eyes lit up when he saw me, but I didn't smile. I sat across from him, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. You look tired, he said softly. I ignored the comment. What do you want, Daniel? He sighed, rubbing his hands together. I made a mistake. I laughed coldly. A mistake? That's what you're calling it. His eyes darkened. I never meant to hurt you. But you did, I snapped. You stood by while Emily destroyed my life. You let it happen. Daniel's jaw tightened. It wasn't like that. Then explain it to me, I said, leaning forward. Make me understand how you ended up in bed with my best friend. His eyes flicked away. It started small. She needed someone to talk to. You were so distracted. Distracted? My chest burned with rage. I was trying to hold everything together while you were sneaking around with Emily. His gaze hardened. She made me feel needed. I froze, anger bubbling beneath my skin. So it's my fault now? I wasn't enough for you. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. My heart hammered painfully against my ribs. I loved you, Daniel said quietly. But somewhere along the way, it changed. I swallowed the lump in my throat. No, Daniel. You changed. He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. His touch felt poisonous now. I'm sorry, he whispered. I stood. Sorry doesn't fix it. As I turned to leave, his hand closed around my wrist. Wait. I yanked free. Don't touch me. When I stepped outside, the cool air hit my face, but it didn't calm the storm inside me. My hands trembled as I walked toward my car. Emily was waiting by the door. Her arms were crossed, her expression amused. How did it go? I glared at her. Stay out of my way, Emily. She smiled sweetly. Why? Afraid you'll lose control. My fists curled at my sides. Don't test me. Emily laughed. Relax. I already won. A sharp, cold wave of fury crashed through me. You think this is over? It is for me. She leaned closer, her voice dropping. Daniel isn't coming back to you. I stepped closer until our faces were inches apart. I don't want him. Her smile slipped. Then what do you want? I smiled faintly. To watch you lose. Emily's eyes narrowed. Be careful, sweetheart. You're not as strong as you think. I leaned in. Neither are you. Her expression hardened as I walked away. My heart thundered in my chest, but beneath the rage was a flicker of something else, determination. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city lights casting a faint glow through the window. My mind raced through every moment I had spent with Daniel and Emily. Every laugh, every touch, every stolen glance I had ignored. I opened my laptop and scrolled through old photos. My wedding day, Emily standing beside me, smiling as if she hadn't already planted the knife in my back. Daniel holding my hand, his eyes full of promises he would never keep. I closed the laptop, my chest burning. I had spent so long being the victim. But that version of me was gone now. The person who sat in the dark, crying over lost love, she didn't exist anymore. Emily had taken everything from me. She had broken me, but broken things can be rebuilt, stronger, sharper. A plan began to form in my mind, quiet at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Emily thought she had won. Daniel thought I would disappear quietly, heartbroken and defeated. They were wrong. I wasn't broken. I was evolving. And when I was ready, they would regret ever underestimating me. Emily sat across from me, her manicured nails tapping rhythmically on the edge of her champagne glass. Her smile was sharp, too sharp, as if she knew something I didn't. The soft hum of conversation around us filled the air, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heartbeat. "You're quiet," Emily said, raising her glass to her lips. I forced a small smile. Just thinking. Her eyes glinted under the dim restaurant lights. "About Daniel?" My jaw tightened. "No." Emily's smile widened. "It's okay, you know. To miss him." I laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "Why would I miss someone who betrayed me?" She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Because you loved him. That's the past." My voice was steady, but my hands curled into fists beneath the table. Emily tilted her head. "Then why did you agree to meet me?" I leaned back, a cold smile tugging at my lips. "Curiosity." Her smile faltered for a brief second before returning. "Curiosity about what?" "About why you're so desperate to see me." Emily's eyes darkened. "I just wanted to check on you." I arched a brow. "After destroying my life." She sighed, setting her glass down with a soft clink. "It wasn't personal." I scoffed. "You stole my husband. That feels pretty personal." Emily's expression sharpened. "You were losing him anyway." I just sped up the process. My chest burned with quiet rage. "And what did you gain from it?" Emily's lips curled. "Daniel, you think he's a prize?" Her eyes narrowed. "He chose me. For now," I said quietly. Her smile faltered. "What does that mean?" I leaned forward, my gaze steady. "Daniel isn't loyal. You of all people should know that." Emily's jaw tightened. "He loves me." I smiled faintly. "That's what I thought too." Her gaze hardened. "You're trying to get inside my head. Am I succeeding?" Emily's eyes flicked away for a brief moment, just long enough for me to know I had struck a nerve. I stood, grabbing my purse. "Good talk, Emily. Let's do it again sometime." As I walked away, I could feel her glare burning into my back. My heart raced, but a small spark of satisfaction flared in my chest. Later that night, I stood by my apartment window, the city lights glittering beneath the dark sky. My reflection stared back at me, calm, controlled. The cracks were still there beneath the surface, but they no longer defined me. My phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "We need to talk." I ignored it. He had made his choice. Now it was my turn. A knock at the door startled me. I crossed the room and opened it. Daniel stood there, his eyes shadowed. "We're done, Daniel," I said flatly. His jaw tightened. "I just need to explain." "You already did." "I was wrong," he said, his voice low. I stepped back. "Why now?" His gaze dropped. "Because Emily." I smiled faintly. "Let me guess. She's not who you thought she was." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "I made a mistake." "You keep saying that." He ran a hand through his hair. "I know I hurt you." "You didn't just hurt me," I said, my voice sharp. "You humiliated me. You let Emily walk all over me while you stood by and watched." Daniel's shoulders slumped. "I didn't know how to stop it." "That's not an excuse." "I loved you," he said quietly. I laughed bitterly. No, Daniel. You love the version of me who forgave everything. His eyes flashed with something close to desperation. We can fix this. I shook my head. No, Daniel. I can fix this. He stepped forward, his hand brushing my arm. I pulled away. You've already made your choice, I said. Now I'm making mine. Daniel's face darkened. You're really done? I should have been done a long time ago. He stared at me for a moment before stepping back. His shoulders straightened as if preparing for a fight. You'll regret this, he said. I smiled faintly. No, Daniel. You will. When he left, I closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. My heart pounded, but beneath the lingering ache was a growing sense of power. I wasn't weak anymore. A few days later, I met Emily for coffee. She had invited me, probably thinking I was still fragile. So, Emily said, swirling her spoon in her cup. Daniel's been quiet. I smiled. I wouldn't know. Her eyes narrowed. He reached out to you? Maybe. Emily's smile stiffened. What did he say? I shrugged. He said he made a mistake. Her hand tightened around her spoon. And I told him it was too late. Emily's eyes flashed with something close to fear. He's mine now. I leaned forward. Keep him. Her brow furrowed. What's your angle? I smiled faintly. Who says I have won? Emily's gaze sharpened. You're up to something. Maybe. She leaned back, studying me with suspicion. You're not the same. No, I said, my smile growing. I'm not. Emily's eyes darkened. Don't think you've won. I stood. Oh, Emily. I've already won. Her lips parted, but I didn't give her the chance to respond. I walked away, my heels clicking softly against the floor. My heart raced, not from fear, but from satisfaction. Daniel and Emily had underestimated me. They thought I would crumble. They thought I would fade away, broken and weak. But I was stronger now. Smarter. Ruthless. They had played their game, now it was my turn. And I wasn't planning to lose. The night was quiet except for the steady patter of rain against the window. The city lights shimmered through the droplets, casting fractured patterns across the floor. I stood by the window, watching the world below as my heart raced. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the final step toward reclaiming my life. My phone buzzed. Daniel's name lit up the screen. Again. I ignored it. He had chosen his path. He had aligned himself with Emily, allowed her lies to poison everything we had built. Now, the consequences were unraveling before him, and he wanted to crawl back. But I was no longer the woman who would take him back with open arms. A sharp knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. My pulse quickened. I crossed the room and opened the door. Daniel stood there, rain dripping from his hair, his shirt plastered to his chest. We need to talk, he said, breathless. I crossed my arms. About what? About us. I leaned against the doorframe. There is no us, Daniel. His eyes darkened. You don't mean that. I mean every word. Daniel took a shaky breath, his hand brushing his damp hair back. I made a mistake. You've said that already. I didn't understand what I was losing, he said, stepping closer. I stood my ground. You didn't lose me. You threw me away. I thought. Emily made me believe. His voice trailed off. I laughed bitterly. Emily didn't force you to betray me. You did that all by yourself. His jaw clenched. I was blind. Too late to open your eyes now. Daniel's gaze searched mine, desperate. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. You're right about that. His hand reached out, brushing my arm. I stepped back, cold seeping into my chest. Why are you here, Daniel? I asked. His eyes softened. Because I can't lose you. I smiled faintly. You already have. He exhaled sharply. You can't just walk away from everything we had. I already did. Daniel's shoulders tensed. Is there someone else? My heart thudded. I smiled, letting the silence stretch between us. His jaw tightened. It's not your business anymore, I said finally. Daniel's eyes darkened. It's him, isn't it? I smiled. It doesn't matter. He stepped forward, his hand grazing my wrist. I can fix this. I pulled away. No, Daniel. You can't. His eyes narrowed. You think you're better off without me? I know I am. His mouth opened as if to protest, but before he could speak, a familiar voice broke the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Daniel's head snapped toward the voice. My heart leaped as I saw James stepping into the hall, calm and composed. His sharp eyes flicked toward Daniel before resting on me. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Of course it's him." James stepped beside me, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. "You heard her," James said coolly. "It's over." Daniel's eyes flashed with anger. "You moved on that fast." I met Daniel's gaze evenly. "You gave me no choice." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "You'll regret this." James chuckled. "She doesn't seem too worried." Daniel's fists clenched. "This isn't over." James's gaze sharpened. "Yes, it is." Daniel's eyes flicked toward me, searching for a crack in my resolve. He found none. After a tense beat, he turned and walked away, his steps heavy against the floor. James smiled as the elevator doors closed behind Daniel. "You okay?" I sighed. "More than okay." James's hand brushed my arm. "You handled that well." "I've learned from the best," I said, smiling faintly. He laughed softly. "Come on, let's get you out of here." James reached for my hand, and this time I didn't hesitate. 2 weeks later, Emily invited me for coffee. Curiosity made me accept. I wanted to see how far she had fallen. Emily sat at the corner table, her eyes shadowed despite the bright morning sun. She smiled faintly as I approached. "You look good," she said, her tone forced. I sat down. "Thank you." Her eyes darkened. "I heard about Daniel." I smiled. "What about him?" "He's not handling it well." "Not my problem." Emily's mouth twitched. "He still loves you." "He had a strange way of showing it." Emily's eyes narrowed. "And James?" I leaned back, letting the silence stretch. "What about him?" Her gaze sharpened. "He's protective." I smiled. "He has a reason to be." Emily's fingers curled around her coffee cup. "You're enjoying this." I met her gaze evenly. "No, I'm just not pretending anymore." Emily's eyes darkened. "Daniel isn't going to give up. He already lost." Emily's smile tightened. "And you think you've won?" "I know I have." Emily's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Be careful." "Thanks for the advice," I said with a smile. Emily's gaze sharpened, but I stood and walked away before she could say another word. My heels clicked softly against the floor as I left her behind. Later that night, James and I stood on the balcony of his apartment, the city lights flickering below. His hand brushed mine as we leaned against the railing. "You're quiet," he said. I smiled faintly. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how different life feels now." James's hand tightened around mine. "Good different." "Very good." James smiled. "No regrets." "None." His eyes softened. "I'm proud of you." I turned toward him. "Why?" "Because you didn't let them break you." My gaze met his, steady and sure. "They underestimated me." James smiled. "That's their loss." A breeze rustled through the night, cool against my skin. James's hand tightened around mine, grounding me. The scars of the past still lingered beneath the surface, but they no longer defined me. I had reclaimed my life, and now I was ready to live it on my own terms. "You know what?" I said. James's eyes lifted toward me. "What?" "I'm finally free." James smiled. "Yes, you are." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it.